15,000 Franks, 20,000 Umayyads. 1 week of staring across cold October ground between Tours and Poitiers. Then 7 days of combat that changed the shape of Europe. They call it the Battle of Tours. Some say it saved Christianity. Others call it a raid blown into myth. But here's what the sources actually show. Names, dates, body counts, and a bastard son who became the hammer. October 10th, 732. Somewhere between the rivers Claine and Vienne in west-central Gaul, a Frankish infantry line holds high ground. Across from them, Umayyad cavalry, fresh from sacking Bordeaux. At stake, the wealthiest shrine in Western Europe at Tours, packed with gold and relics. The Umayyad governor Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi commands forces that have swept from Damascus through North Africa, across Hispania, over the Pyrenees, 50 years of conquest. Now they push into Francia. Facing them is Charles, mayor of the Palace of Austrasia. Not even a king, a bastard, born 688 to Pippin of Herstal and a noblewoman named Alpaida. When Pippin died in 714, his legitimate wife, Plectrude, imprisoned Charles. Charles escaped, beat the Neustrians at Amblève in 716, crushed them at Vincy in 717. By 718, he controlled the Frankish realm without holding the throne. The Merovingian kings were puppets. Charles pulled the strings. Each Frankish soldier carried 70 pounds of weapons and armor. Round shields nearly 3 feet in diameter, curved. Heavy hardwood construction with iron fittings covered in leather. Small conical iron helmets, chainmail shirts for the wealthy. Leather jerkins covered with metal scales for the rest. Spears 6 to 8 feet long with iron heads. The primary weapon held in one hand for thrusting. Semi-spatha swords about 15 inches long, designed for stabbing. Longer sacks or scramasax blades for slashing. And the Francisca, the distinctive Frankish throwing axe. These men were large, physically formidable. The Germanic tribes had cultivated a military culture that encouraged face-to-face fighting with edged weapons. When formed in dense formation, nearly invulnerable. In open skirmishing, helpless. Charles knew this, chose terrain accordingly. If you value documented medieval warfare and political history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. The script is researched and factual using sources from the Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, written by an anonymous Christian chronicler living under Arab rule in Al-Andalus just 22 years after the battle. It contains the most detailed contemporary account we have, and the continuations of Fredegar, compiled in the mid-8th century and considered essential Carolingian sources. These aren't generic medieval texts. They're eyewitness-era accounts that modern historians like Roger Collins in The Arab Conquest of Spain, 711-797, and Kenneth Baxter Wolfe in Conquerors and Chroniclers of Early Medieval Spain use as their primary foundation. Now back to the information. The Umayyad Caliphate in 732 stretched from the Indus to the Atlantic. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad landed at Gibraltar with 10 to 11,000 troops, mostly Berbers, defeated the Visigothic King Roderick at the Guadalete River in July, took Toledo. Musa ibn Nusayr followed with a similar force. By 719, they controlled Septimania in southern Gaul, established a capital at Narbonne. But 11 years before Tours, something happened that everyone forgot. June 9th, 721, Toulouse. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Qawlani, the Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus, besieged Aquitaine's most important city. His army included siege engines, infantry, cavalry, Basque slingers. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, called Udes by the Franks, left to find help, asked Charles Martel for assistance. Charles refused, preferred to watch his southern rival struggle. 3 months passed. Toulouse was about to surrender. Then Odo returned with Aquitanian and Frankish troops. The Umayyads had grown overconfident, stopped maintaining strong outer defenses around their siege camp, stopped scouting. Fatal mistake. Odo launched a surprise attack, classic enveloping movement, hit the siege force from behind while troops inside Toulouse attacked from the walls. The Umayyad camp scattered. Soldiers resting or fleeing without weapons or armor were cut down. Al-Sam escaped with a fraction of his forces, died shortly after from his wounds. The Pope in Rome hailed Odo as champion of Christianity, sent him gifts. Arab historians called it a total disaster. The Balat al-Shuhada of Toulouse. Muslims in Al-Andalus would remember it for 450 years. Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi had been there. Watched that defeat, learned, remembered. In 730, Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik appointed him governor of Al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman spent 731 consolidating. The Berber deputy governor Uthman ibn Naisa had allied with Odo to carve out an independent Catalonia. Abd al-Rahman rode north, engaged Uthman's forces, killed him. Some sources say Uthman killed himself. Either way, Catalonia fell back under Umayyad control. Abd al-Rahman then assembled troops in Pamplona, called for recruits from Yemen and the Levant. Many arrived. He crossed the Pyrenees in spring 732 with a force modern historians estimate between 20,000 and 30,000 men, mostly Arab cavalry and Berber light infantry. Older chronicles claim 80,000, logistically impossible. The terrain couldn't support it. Food supply calculations, road capacity, seasonal forage. Historian Victor Davis Hansen and Edward A. Schoenfeld both argue 20 to 30,000 is the ceiling. The Spanish land couldn't feed massive armies. Henri IV of France later said, "In Spain, large armies starve, small armies are defeated. The Umayyad column moved through Gascony." One Arab source describes it. That army went through all places like a desolating storm. They reached Bordeaux in June 732. Odo gathered his forces on the north side of the Dordogne River, defending a bridge on the Roman road to Saintes. Abd al-Rahman sent a flanking force upstream, hit Odo's army from the side. The Battle of the River Garonne turned into slaughter. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754 recorded it. God alone knows the number of the slain. Bordeaux burned. Odo's army shattered. He rode north with his surviving retainers to Charles Martel. Charles was campaigning against the Bavarians along the Danube when news arrived. He force-marched his army west. Odo met him somewhere near Paris. The terms were clear: Frankish military support in exchange for Odo's submission to Frankish authority. Aquitaine would acknowledge Charles as overlord. Odo agreed. Charles issued a ban, a general summons. He assembled an army modern historians estimate between 15,000 and 25,000. The corps: veteran Frankish infantry, his entrustions, elite bodyguards, and male hauberks. These were professional soldiers Charles had campaigned with for years. Men from the same estates or towns stood together. Feudal vassals gathered around their lords. The army included Neustrian and Austrasian allies, Aquitanians who'd escaped north to fight, and large numbers of infantry conscripts protecting their homes. Only about 20% fought on horseback, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 mounted troops. The Frankish army was primarily mounted infantry who dismounted to fight. Once dismounted, they formed the dense, unarticulated formations their ancestors had used for centuries. Charles had some shock cavalry, wealthier nobles in mail hauberks and helmets carrying round shields, using long swords and lances. But 80% were infantry: axes, swords, spears, shields, minimal cavalry. The Franks were an infantry force. Charles moved south, avoiding old Roman roads, hoping for surprise. The Umayyads weren't scouting. They'd crushed every force they'd met. Duke Odo at Bordeaux, then again at the Garonne. They didn't consider the Franks a serious threat. That oversight cost them. Charles reached the Loire River near Tours in early October, positioned his forces on high ground between the Claine and Vienne, wooded terrain, defensible. Trees would break up cavalry charges. High ground gave his infantry advantage, forced the Umayyads to attack uphill, negate their mobility, classic defensive positioning. Abd al-Rahman had been pushing toward Tours, specifically toward the Abbey of St. Martin, the wealthiest and holiest shrine in Western Europe at the time, packed with gold, silver, relics. The Umayyad forces were laden with plunder from Bordeaux. They'd split into raiding parties across southern Gaul. When scouts reported Frankish forces blocking the road, Abd al-Rahman pulled back slightly to better ground near Poitiers. Exact battlefield location unknown. Possibilities include Musset-la-Bataille, Senon near Nantes, or hamlets near Loudun, all between Tours and Poitiers. Abd al-Rahman recalled his scattered raiding parties, needed full strength for this confrontation. The Umayyad army was different from the Franks in every way. Light armor, mobility over protection, Arab cavalry, elite Courasaniya, heavy cavalry with lances and scimitars, Berber light infantry with javelins, archers with composite bows, mounted archers. Their tactics: car, wafar, hit and run, charge, wheel, fire arrows, withdraw, charge again. Worked brilliantly in open terrain against dispersed enemies. In 700 years of Islamic expansion, these tactics had conquered everything from Persia to the Pyrenees. But here, dense forest, uphill attack, against a wall of heavy infantry with overlapping shields. Different battlefield entirely. The two armies faced each other. 7 days? The Mozarabic Chronicle says they tormented each other with raids for almost 7 days. Minor skirmishes, probing, testing. Charles stayed on the high ground, used the forest to screen his true numbers, formed his troops in a tight defensive formation. Sources describe it as immobile as a wall, holding together like a glacier in cold regions. A phalanx, shield wall. The round shields overlapped, creating an almost solid barrier. Spears pointed forward. The discipline required to maintain this formation under repeated cavalry attacks was remarkable. Just over a century before Tours, Frankish soldiers had been described as disobedient to their leaders, despising good order. Charles had changed that, drilled his men, created a professional corps. The veterans held the center, conscripts protected the flanks. Abd al-Rahman waited for his raiding parties to rejoin the main body. During those 6 days before the main battle, he recalled columns that had scattered to pillage. They arrived heavy with loot from churches, monasteries, estates across southern Gaul. By the 7th day, both forces were at full strength. But that loot created a problem. The Umayyad army was encumbered. Slow, protective of their plunder, many had fought for booty more than ideology. These were regional juns, troops who swelled Islamic ranks in times of victory, evaporated in times of trouble. Not the core Arab forces that had exploded out of Arabia a century before. Neither commander wanted to attack. Charles knew his infantry couldn't pursue cavalry effectively. If he came down from the hills, the Umayyad horsemen would cut his men apart in open ground. Abd al-Rahman knew charging uphill through trees would negate his cavalry's advantages. The forest hindered cavalry charges, forcing his forces into piecemeal attacks. Small units hitting the Frankish line separately instead of massive, coordinated charges. But he couldn't wait indefinitely. Tours was the prize. To get it, he had to go through Charles. The waiting game had a clock, supplies, weather. October in northern Gaul meant cold nights, rain, mud. Morale. On October 10th, 732, Abd al-Rahman gave the order to attack. The Umayyad cavalry charged uphill. The Mozarabic chronicle. The northern peoples remained as immobile as a wall. In the blink of an eye, they annihilated the Arabs with the sword. Frankish sources claim the infantry held. Repeated cavalry charges, wave after wave. The Arabs would close the gap, crash into the shield wall. Lances thrust forward, swords swung. The Frankish line absorbed the impact. Spears jabbed at horses and riders. Shields caught lance thrusts. When cavalry broke through gaps, the infantry closed ranks, surrounded isolated horsemen, cut them down with axes and swords. Each time the Franks held, the shield wall didn't break. Hours of this, grinding, brutal combat. The Umayyad horse archers made their presence felt. Arrows rained down on the Frankish center, hitting unarmored conscripts between the armored nobles. Casualties mounted, but the formation held. The Frankish tactic was tactically flexible. Used defensively here at Tours, later at the River Bear, they'd use the same formation offensively, advancing slowly, step by step, driving survivors into the sea. But at Tours, purely defensive. Stand, hold, kill, repeat. The obedience required from Frankish soldiers to maintain tight formation under repeated attacks was extraordinary. These weren't Roman legions with centuries of discipline. These were Germanic tribesmen, a few generations removed from fighting as scattered warbands. Charles had built something new, a professional Frankish war machine. Then something broke. Accounts vary. Some sources say Duke Odo led a flanking force around to the Umayyad camp, started looting the baggage train, all the plunder from Bordeaux, supplies, treasure, the wealth accumulated from weeks of raiding across Aquitaine. When word reached the Umayyad cavalry that their camp was being raided, discipline fractured. Units broke off to protect their possessions. These Jun troops fought primarily for booty. Their commanders couldn't hold them when they heard their loot was being stolen. Confusion spread, coordination collapsed. Other accounts say it was simply exhaustion, casualties mounting, the realization that the Frankish wall wouldn't break. The repeated charges had achieved nothing. Dead horses and men littered the slope. The Franks kept standing, kept fighting, kept killing. In the chaos, Abd al-Rahman pushed forward, tried to rally his forces, restore order, lead from the front. The Mozarabic chronicle, the people of Austrasia, greater in number of soldiers and formidably armed, killed the king, Abd al-Rahman, when they found him, striking him on the chest. The Umayyad governor died in combat, whether from a Frankish spear, sword thrust, an axe blow, the sources don't specify, just that he fell. And with their commander dead, cohesion collapsed completely. Some units fought on, others broke. Some Umayyad forces regained control of their camp by evening, drove off Odo's raiders. But the battle was over. Charles didn't pursue, suspected a trap. Night fell. The Franks waited for dawn, kept their formation. Guards posted, expected renewed fighting at first light. Morning came. Frankish soldiers assembled, expecting renewed battle. Scouts approached the Umayyad camp, found it empty. During the night, the remaining Umayyad forces had retreated south. They left most of their plunder behind. The battlefield was littered with bodies. Later sources claim Umayyad casualties at 25,000 or higher. Frankish losses, reportedly around 1,500. These numbers are contested. Medieval chroniclers inflated figures. But the Mozarabic chronicle, written closest to the events, confirms heavy Umayyad casualties and lighter. Frankish losses. The Franks held the field. The Umayyads withdrew over the Pyrenees. This is where myth starts to blur history. 19th century historians like Edward Gibbon wrote that Tours saved Christendom. Gibbon claimed that without Charles Martel's victory, the Quran might be taught at Oxford instead of the Bible. Romantic, dramatic, partially true, partially exaggeration. Modern historians split into camps. One group, historians like William Watson, Houston Smith, Victor Davis Hanson, argues Tours was macro-historically significant. It stopped Umayyad expansion into Western Europe at a critical moment. The other group, Alessandro Barbero, Paul Farracher, and others, argues the battle has been massively overstated. They point out the Umayyad force was a raid, not a full invasion. That internal problems in the caliphate, the Great Berber Revolt of 740, civil war, mattered more than one battle. Here's what the sources show. Tours didn't end Umayyad presence in Gaul. In 734 or 735, a larger invasion came by sea. Yusuf ibn Abd al-Rahman al-Fihri, governor of Narbonne, and Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj launched an attack into Aquitaine and the Rhone Valley, captured Carcassonne, Nimes, Valence, Lyon, devastated the area around Vienne. Duke Maurontus of Provence allied with them. Yusuf's troops entered Avignon without a fight. Charles was campaigning in Frisia when it happened, couldn't respond until 736. In 736, Charles sent his brother Duke Childebrand south with dukes and counts. Childebrand laid siege to Avignon, held the field until Charles arrived with the main army. Charles attacked Avignon with rope ladders and battering rams. Brutal frontal assault, smashed through the gates, scaled the walls. Though he had some catapults, the city fell primarily to direct infantry assault. Avignon burned to the ground. The army crossed the Rhone into Septimania, laid siege to Narbonne. Charles had developed something new, heavy cavalry with stirrups. 5 years after Tours, he'd built a mounted force to match the Umayyads, seized church lands to pay for it, needed year-round professional troops. That required money. The church nearly excommunicated him for it. But he understood what Tours had taught him. Infantry alone wasn't enough. To defeat cavalry in offensive operations, to pursue and destroy scattered enemies, he needed cavalry himself. By 736, he had it. His ability to coordinate infantry and cavalry veterans was unequaled in that era. At the Battle of the River Bear in 737, near Narbonne, Frankish forces intercepted a large Umayyad relief column led by Uqba ibn al-Hajjaj. This force had been sent from Iberia to relieve the garrison during the siege of Narbonne. The Frankish army met them at the mouth of the River Bear in the Aude region, crushed them. The combination of disciplined infantry and heavy cavalry proved devastating, pursued the survivors into nearby sea lagoons, took much booty, many prisoners. Then Charles marched through Septimania, destroying Umayyad strongholds. Agde, Béziers, Maguelone, Nîmes, all devastated, cities and suburbs destroyed, rendered useless as military outposts. Historian Antonio Santosuoso argues the Battle of the River Bear was as important as Tours for defending Christendom, possibly more so. This wasn't a defensive victory, this was offensive warfare, destroying Umayyad field armies, eliminating their bases in Gaul. Charles didn't take Narbonne, couldn't commit to an indefinite siege. The city was heavily fortified, well supplied by sea. Duke Hunold of Aquitaine was threatening his lines of communication with the north. Duke Maurontus of Provence was raising a revolt from Marseille. Charles had accomplished his primary goal, destroyed the Umayyad field armies in Septimania, isolated the remaining garrison in Narbonne. He withdrew. In 739, he returned to expel Maurontus from Marseille, regain control of Provence. Historian Antonio Santosuoso argues these campaigns, 736 and 737, were at least as important as Tours for defending Western Christianity. They crushed any hope of Umayyad expansion while the Caliphate was still united. Between 732 and 741, Charles reorganized Frankish governance and military structure. He'd seized church property to fund his professional army. Lands that had been church estates became fiefs granted to warriors who would serve year-round. This created a new military class, men who trained constantly, who could be called up at any time, who had the resources to maintain equipment and horses. The feudal system's origins. The church hated it. But after Tours, after the 736 and 737 campaigns, Rome needed Charles more than Charles needed Rome's approval. Pope Gregory II wrote him multiple times asking for protection and aid. The papacy recognized that without Charles, Umayyad forces might reach Rome itself. In 737, King Theuderic IV died. Charles didn't appoint a replacement. For the last 4 years of his life, he ruled without even the pretense of a Merovingian king, titled himself Mayor Domus and Princeps, et Dux Francorum, mayor of the palace and prince and duke of the Franks. The Merovingian dynasty had become irrelevant. Everyone knew who really held power. Between 732 and 741, he reorganized Burgundy, replaced counts and dukes with loyal supporters, invaded Frisia again in 734, killed Duke Bubo at the Battle of the Bourne, destroyed Frisian pagan shrines. Every pagan shrine in Frisia leveled, subjugated the region so thoroughly it stayed peaceful for 20 years. The Saxons received similar treatment. Repeated campaigns, pushing them back to the Weser, the Lippe, the Ruhr, securing Frankish borders on all sides while maintaining pressure on Umayyad territories in the south. By 740, Charles was ill. Thoughts turned to succession. He'd produced many sons, legitimate and illegitimate, divided the Frankish lands between Carloman and Pippin III, later called Pippin the Short. Carloman got Austrasia, Alemannia, Thuringia, the eastern territories. Pippin got Neustria, Burgundy, Provence, the western and southern territories. The division made strategic sense. Both sons were capable. Both had campaigned with their father. Both understood how Charles had built Frankish power. October 22nd, 741, Charles died at his palace at Kierzy, buried at Saint-Denis alongside Merovingian kings. The irony, a man who never claimed the crown buried with the dynasty he'd rendered obsolete. 10 years later, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian, established the Carolingian dynasty. Charles' grandson, Charlemagne, crowned emperor on Christmas Day 800. The nickname Martel, the Hammer, came later. 9th century chroniclers gave it to him not for a single battle, but for his entire career of victories. He'd unified Francia, held off the Saxons, crushed the Frisians, stopped Umayyad expansion. The Mozarabic Chronicle is the only contemporary source to use the term Europeans, Europenses, describing the Franks who defeated the Saracens at Tours. First known use of that word in Latin. What does the archaeological record show? Not much survives from Tours itself. No mass grave clearly linked to the battle. The exact location remains unknown despite centuries of searching. What we have are the texts, 3 Latin sources from the 8th and 9th centuries. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, the continuations of Fredegar, the Liber Historiae Francorum. One Arabic source, Ibn Abd al-Hakam, writing in the 9th century. They're brief, vague on details. Don't give precise troop numbers, don't describe tactics in depth. Modern historians have to infer from what societies could support logistically, what commanders could raise and feed, what terrain permitted. The continuations of Fredegar describe Charles as a warrior uncommonly effective in battle. The Mozarabic Chronicle says the Franks were formidably armed, greater in number, though Western sources dispute the numbers, estimating Franks at 30,000 or less, half the Umayyad force. Ibn Abd al-Hakam places the battle in Hijri, year 115, between February 733 and February 734. The Chronicle of 754 says Abd al-Rahman was governor for nearly 3 years, appointed in Spanish era, year 769, Hijri 113. If he took the job in March 731 and served nearly 3 years, the battle could have been late 733. Dating is messy. Most historians use October 10, 732, based on Frankish annals, which are generally reliable on chronology. The Chronicle of Moissac confirms 732. What's certain, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi died in combat. The Umayyad forces withdrew. Charles held the field. The wealthy abbey of St. Martin at Tours wasn't sacked. Umayyad expansion into Francia stopped, not permanently. Raids continued for years, but the momentum broke. In 750, the Umayyad Caliphate collapsed. Battle of the Zab. Abbasids took power. The unified caliphate fractured. Abd al-Rahman I, a surviving Umayyad, fled to Hispania, established the Emirate of Cordoba in 756, independent of Baghdad. Without central caliphate support, further large-scale invasions of Gaul became impossible. Did Tours save Christianity? Overstated. Did it matter? Yes. Not because of one day's fighting, but because Charles proved Frankish infantry could stand against Umayyad cavalry. That victory gave him the prestige and resources to reorganize Francia, develop heavy cavalry, launch the campaigns of 736 and 737 that cleared Umayyad forces from Provence and most of Septimania. Those campaigns mattered. Tours was the first domino. The debate rages among modern historians. One camp, Victor Davis Hanson, William Watson, Houston Smith, Paul Davis, argues Tours had genuine macro-historical significance, changed the trajectory of European development. Watson writes that the subsequent history of the West would have proceeded along vastly different currents had Abd ar-Rahman been victorious. Hanson points out that most 18th and 19th century historians saw Tours as marking the high tide of Muslim advance into Europe. Leopold von Ranke called it the turning point of one of the most important epochs in world history. These historians argue that even if the Umayyads were primarily raiding, a victory at Tours would have given them forward bases, momentum, and the confidence to launch full invasions. Charles' victory stopped that possibility cold. The other camp, Alessandro Barbero, Paul Farache, and others, argues the battle has been massively mythologized. Barbero writes that today historians tend to play down the significance, pointing out that the Arab force defeated by Charles Martel was not attempting to conquer the Frankish kingdom, but simply to pillage the wealthy monastery of St. Martin. They emphasize internal problems in the caliphate. The Great Berber Revolt of 740, the Abbasid Revolution, civil strife, mattered more than battlefield defeats. The Umayyads lacked resources for permanent conquest, were overextended, would have withdrawn regardless. But even skeptics acknowledge Tours mattered for Charles personally. It gave him the political capital to rule without appointing a king, to seize church lands, to reorganize Frankish administration. Strengthened Frankish military prestige, helped unify Western Christendom under emerging Carolingian leadership. Whether Tours saved Europe from Islam is debatable. That it saved Charles's political position and enabled his subsequent consolidation of power is fact. Charles didn't just fight Muslims. He fought Saxons, Frisians, Bavarians, Rebellious Frankish nobles, Aquitanian dukes who resented his authority. He seized church lands to pay his soldiers, needed year-round troops, not seasonal levies, that required money. The church was enraged. Charles nearly faced excommunication. But then Tours happened. Then the 736 and 737 campaigns. Suddenly, the church needed him. Pope Gregory II wrote him multiple times asking for protection and aid. By the time Charles died, he was recognized as Christendom's paramount defender. Let's talk numbers one more time. Paul Davis, in 1999, estimated 80,000 Umayyads, 30,000 Franks. Modern historians using land support calculations, how much food an area could produce, how many animals could forage, how many men could move on available roads, argue 20 to 30,000 on each side. Schoenfeld calls anything over 50,000 logistically impossible for 8th century Iberia and Gaul. Hansen suggests both armies were roughly the same size, 20 to 30,000 men. Contemporary sources don't give numbers. Later sources inflate wildly. The truth is probably in the middle of the modern estimates. Casualties? Later chronicles claim 1,500 Frankish dead, 375,000 Umayyad dead. That's absurd. Same casualty figures appear for Odo's victory at Toulouse in 721. Chronicles copied numbers without checking. Realistic estimate based on logistics and ancient battle patterns. Maybe 5,000 to 10,000 Umayyad casualties, 1,000 to 3,000 Frankish casualties. Heavy losses for the time, enough to break Umayyad cohesion and force withdrawal. Weaponry. Franks carried Franciscus, throwing axes, spathi, long swords, squamus axes, single-edged fighting knives, spears, javelins, round shields about 30 inches across, mail hauberks for the wealthy, Spangenhelm helmets, segmented construction with nasal guards. Most soldiers had less. Leather armor, padded cloth, simple caps. Umayyad forces, Arab cavalry with lances, scimitars, composite bows, light armor preferring mobility, Berber infantry with javelins, short swords, small shields. Both sides used horses, but Frankish cavalry was minimal at Tours. Charles learned. By 736, he had heavy cavalry. Terrain decided Tours. High ground, trees. The Umayyad cavalry couldn't maneuver, couldn't build momentum for effective charges. Had to attack uphill through forest. Every advantage went to the Franks. Charles chose his ground carefully, waited, made the Umayyads come to him. It worked. After Tours, Frankish chroniclers elevated Charles. Before 732, he was mayor of the palace, fighting to consolidate power against rebellious nobles and foreign enemies. After 732, he was the savior of Christendom, the defender of the faith, the hammer who crushed invaders. That reputation gave him the political capital to rule without appointing a king, to reorganize Frankish administration, to seize church lands, to build the foundation his son and grandson would use to create the Carolingian Empire. The Umayyads never invaded Gaul in force again. Smaller raids, yes. Narbonne stayed in Muslim hands until 759 when Pippin the Short took it. Charlemagne later established the Spanish March across the Pyrenees, reconquered Girona in 785, Barcelona in 801, created a buffer zone. But the era of Umayyad expansion into Europe ended with the 730s campaigns. Internal strife, the Great Berber Revolt, 740 to 743, the Abbasid Revolution, 750, turned Umayyad attention elsewhere. Some historians argue that even without Tours, the Umayyads couldn't have held Gaul. Supply lines too long, terrain too difficult, local resistance too strong. Before Tours, 2 Muslim sieges of Constantinople failed. 717 to 718 siege ended when Byzantine Emperor Leo III defeated them. That mattered as much or more than Tours for stopping eastern expansion. By 732, Muslim soldiers often lacked the zeal of earlier generations, more interested in plunder than conquest. Internal ethnic divisions, Arabs versus Berbers, weakened cohesion. But none of that diminishes what Charles accomplished. He faced a force that had conquered from the Indus to the Pyrenees in a century, defeated them, then defeated them again and again, built a military machine that dominated Western Europe for generations. His family ruled Francia for over 2 centuries. His legacy shaped medieval Europe. The sources don't give us a blow-by-blow of the fighting. We don't know exactly where men stood, how units maneuvered, which flank broke first. What we know, 7 days of skirmishing, 1 day of heavy combat, Abd al-Rahman dead, Umayyad forces withdrawn, Franks victorious. Everything else is inference, educated guesses based on what we know about 8th century warfare, terrain, logistics, and human behavior under stress. The Mozarabic Chronicle, our best source, is frustratingly brief, fewer than 200 words on the battle itself. But it was written by someone living in Al-Andalus under Muslim rule. No reason to exaggerate Frankish victory, no political need to inflate the importance. The chronicler recorded what happened. The Franks stood like a wall, killed the Umayyad king, won the field. Simple, direct. That simplicity gives it credibility. The continuations of Fredegar are more expansive, but overtly pro-Carolingian, written to glorify Charles and his descendants. The Liber Historiae Francorum similarly biased toward the Franks. Ibn Abd al-Hakam's 9th century Arabic account is brief, acknowledges the defeat, moves on. Arab historians didn't dwell on Tours. It wasn't seen as particularly significant in the Islamic world, just another raid that failed. The loss of Abd al-Rahman mattered. He was considered an able administrator and commander. But the strategic implications? Less clear to contemporary Muslim writers. What the archaeology shows? Nothing definitive, no battlefield markers, no mass graves clearly linked to Tours. The exact location remains unknown despite centuries of searching. Musset's La Bataille has the most compelling case based on place name evidence and geographic positioning between the clan and Vienne, but no physical evidence confirms it. What we have are the chronicles, the testimony of writers who lived within a generation of the events, who had access to eyewitnesses, who recorded what they knew or heard, imperfect sources, incomplete, sometimes contradictory, but the best we have. Charles Martel's story is one of grit, timing, and tactical brilliance. Born illegitimate, imprisoned by his stepmother, escaped, fought his way to power, unified a fractured realm, faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable, found the right ground, the right formation, the right moment to stand, won, then kept winning, built a dynasty that would reshape Europe. Tours matters not because it saved civilization in one afternoon. It matters because it demonstrated that determined infantry on good ground could stop cavalry that had conquered half the known world. It matters because it gave Charles the prestige to reorganize Francia, develop new military capabilities, and launch the campaigns that actually cleared Umayyad forces from Gaul. It matters because it marked the high water mark of Umayyad expansion in the west, not because they couldn't have gone farther, but because after Tours, after 736 and 737, after internal collapse, they never tried again. The momentum broke, the tide turned, the window closed. Historians will keep debating, was Tours decisive, or just one battle among many? Did Charles save Christianity, or just win a local conflict? The sources can't give definitive answers. Too brief, too incomplete, too contradictory on details. What they can give are facts. October 10, 732. Somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi led Umayyad forces north. Charles Martel led Frankish forces to meet them. The Franks held high ground. The Umayyads attacked. Abd al-Rahman died. The Umayyads withdrew. Charles won. Everything that followed, Frankish dominance, Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne's coronation, built on that foundation. Not inevitably, not automatically, but it built. 60 years after Tours, on Christmas Day 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charles' grandson emperor. The Carolingian Renaissance, arts, learning, monasteries, literacy, emerged from the stability Charles established. That stability came from military victories, Tours, the campaigns against Saxons and Frisians, the 736 and 737 campaigns against the Umayyads, reorganizing Frankish administration and military structure, building a professional army that could win consistently. Charles Martel never called himself king, never wore a crown, ruled as mayor of the palace, prince and duke of the Franks, but he built an empire in all but name. His son formalized it by deposing the last Merovingian. His grandson expanded it across most of Western Europe. The Carolingian Empire lasted until 887. The consequences lasted much longer. The idea of a unified Christian Western Europe, the concept of a Holy Roman Empire, the development of feudalism, medieval military tactics, all trace back through Charlemagne to Pippin, to Charles Martel, to Tours. In 759, 18 years after Charles' death, his son Pippin the Short finally took Narbonne. The last Umayyad stronghold in Gaul fell. The process Charles started at Tours finished a generation later. The Umayyads pulled back to Al-Andalus, stayed there for centuries. The Emirate of Cordoba became the Caliphate of Cordoba in 929, lasted until 1031, but they never seriously threatened Francia again. The battlefield at Tours holds no monuments, no markers. Archaeologists haven't found the mass graves. The exact spot where Abd al-Rahman fell, where the Frankish wall held, where history pivoted, unknown. What remains are the chronicles. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, written in Al-Andalus by a Christian under Muslim rule. The continuations of Fredegar, compiled in Francia to glorify the Carolingians. The Liber Historiae Francorum, Ibn Abd al-Hakam's Arabic account. Brief, incomplete, contradictory on details, consistent on the outcome. Charles Martel died October 22nd, 741, 9 years after Tours, buried at Saint Denis. His epitaph, if he had one, doesn't survive. What survives is his legacy, the Frankish realm he unified, the military structure he built, the campaigns he won, the dynasty he founded, the empire his grandson ruled, medieval Europe shaped by a bastard who became the hammer. Here's the final fact that reframes everything. In 984, Hugh Capet, descendant of a Carolingian noble, was elected king of West Francia. Capetian dynasty, ruled France until 1792, nearly 800 years. Charles Martel's unification of Francia, his defeat of the Umayyads, his reorganization of Frankish administration. That's the foundation. Everything French kingship became traces back through the Capetians to the Carolingians to Charles Martel to October 10, 732. 1 week of waiting, 1 day of combat, 1 dead governor, 1 victorious mayor of the palace who never called himself king. That's how history turns. The Mozarabic chronicles last line on the battle. In the blink of an eye, they annihilated the Arabs with the sword. Cold, quotable, true enough. The Frankish phalanx held. Abd al-Rahman died. The Umayyads retreated. Charles earned his nickname, and Western Europe took a different path than it might have.